If you guys have questions or you think you're going to have questions, we do have a mic set up at the front of the room. So if you don't want to make the long walk later, come sit up front now, and then it'll be really easy to do that. So I'm going to give you guys a very brief introduction, but if you go into the app and you go into speakers and you look up any one of our speakers by name, you can see their full bios. So we're not going to waste our valuable time together today going through everybody's bios, but suffice to say that you are in the presence of some awesome leaders within the industry, and we've brought some very specific areas of expertise to the discussion today, which we'll cover in a minute. So if you guys haven't met me, my name is Heather Dietzig. I'm the Vice President of Policy for the ABC. So I do everything local, state, federal, sort of leading all of our policy activities across the country. And we'll talk about a little bit today, a little bit more in Europe and international as well. And with me today, I have Amish. So Amish is a partner at H&K, Holland & Knight, and he is an expert in tax policy, has a long history in the RNG and biogas sector. We have Richard Corey. So Richard Corey works with ABC as a policy advisor for our California LCFS program. He has a long, great history with CARB, and so he'll bring some very California-specific expertise to our discussion today. And then we have Ben Gerber. So Ben is the CEO of MRETS, and if you guys are not familiar with MRETS, very important for renewable thermal certificates and market tracking. So as we talk about things like mass balance and book and claim and environmental attributes, Ben will be able to help us through that, and also has some developing and emerging expertise in the European markets as well. So the reason we put this policy panel together today was really to talk about the 30,000-foot view of where policy in the industry is today. There's a ton of opportunity to pin down these experts and others who are attending this conference to talk about the nitty-gritty, right? So when you guys think about tax policy, we're not going to be talking about the specifics around, say, 48 ITC today, right? Like, we're not going to be getting into the weeds on some of the specifics. What we want to talk about in this panel is reviewing everything that we've heard over the last year, and what does that actually mean for directional conversations about where the industry is going. What policy trends have we seen develop since the last time we got together here at Biogas Americas? And a little bit of crystal ball for how policy might support the developing markets, not only domestically, but also across the pond. So without further ado, we're just going to jump right into it. We'll leave 15 to 20 minutes at the end of our panel today for questions. We really encourage you guys to bring your questions to this team. It makes this highly valuable. So like I said, for those who may not have been in the room yet, we do plan to have Q&A at the end, and the mic is up front. So we're going to go through and we'll try and be organized, but we're really focused on tax policy because of IRA implementation and all of the benefits that came with the IRA and the flurry of activity we've seen out of IRS and Treasury. We're going to be covering California LCFS, some of the rule changes there, and then also some of the carbon markets, attributes, and European markets. So that's where we're going to focus today. So kicking it off, I'm going to ask Amish first. So we've seen a ton coming out of Treasury this year, but we still have a ton of things left to come. So if you could look back over the last 12 months, have you seen any themes develop around the guidance with respect specifically to biogas and RNG? Are we seeing positive trends, negative trends, or similar treatments as each of these sections roll out of Treasury?
Yeah, I mean, what I think we're seeing is, the government's still trying to get their arms around some technologies, including RNG. So, and I think the government also thinking about how are they actually going to administer this going forward, and that's a lot of the concern. So when you kind of look back historically at all of these incentives for tax credits, there were things that tax people who mostly aren't engineers within the government could understand. You know, solar, it was wind, there were things that people could understand. And when you start getting into RNG, hydrogen, other sorts of technologies, there are things that require, deeper understanding of the technology than I think a lot of tax people normally have. So I think one of the trends is really just people within the government who do tax policy, understanding this technology and trying to get their arms around. So when I look at, for example, the 48 guidance and the way that they approached that at first of making gas upgrade not eligible and then treating it as an integral part, I think some of that reflects just a lack of understanding about how the technology works, what's important to get to meet the criteria for the tax credit, but to understand technology to do that. We're seeing the same thing in hydrogen. When you look at 45V guidance on things like RNG, the same thing happened with nuclear. They actually didn't issue proposed regulations. And so what we have there is a situation where they floated some potential proposed regulations by putting language in the preamble regarding this productive first use requirement, but they didn't actually put in regulatory language. And so what I think we're seeing a lot of are some trial balloons, where they need to they've got to put, and we're glad they're doing this. I don't like what they're saying so far, but the approach of actually putting something on paper we can shoot at is really important to do, and now we're shooting at it. But because of where we sit today on all of this guidance, it's just we're at this critical point, and I think people are getting a little bit tired of all the discussions with IRS and Treasury and DOE and others about all of this guidance, because we've been talking to them about it for it seems like forever now, but we really can't stop. They are looking for guidance, they're looking for information, they're looking for industry. We talk to the folks at IRS and Treasury all the time, and they're telling us they're thirsty for more knowledge. They want to know how this is actually working, how the rules are working. So we need to keep, we just need to make sure we're getting in there. The other big theme is administrability. They are so worried about how IRS auditors are going to implement this. And, we do a lot of tax controversy work in much simpler circumstances. And, sometimes IRS auditors are very challenged by those audits. And so when we think about, how an IRS auditor is going to understand the new technology, how they're going to understand GREET scores, CI reductions, I'm not sure how they're going to do it, but clearly that shows up in this guidance, because you see things like kind of simplified versions of what the statute says, and they're simplified, I think, to some extent to try and make it easier to audit at some point.
So I think you touched on one thing that gives the industry heartburn, which is precedent setting. So we have these things, spaghetti on the wall, if you will. We've got things on paper now. And I think that there's this fear that what is on paper now will just be cut and paste, rinse and repeat, as each one of these sections start to roll out. So, we've got a handful on paper, but we've got a handful still around the corner. What do you perceive as the risk that Treasury just goes, yep, we have that on paper, and we're just going to cut and paste that, rinse and repeat, and we'll see how it works, and we'll deal with any issues later? What's the risk there?
I think it's I'm not sure if it's a pure cut and paste, but that's certainly their starting point, right? So Treasury, historically, Treasury has not had to think about, these sorts of rules, how you do CI scoring. And so they've spent, a year and a half now thinking about how you do CI scoring, in 45V and 40B. And they've put in a lot of work on this. And there have been, this requires interagency discussions and negotiations and just a lot of work. When you think about trying to get rules through Treasury and the IRS, it's difficult enough when we're trying to get Treasury to do something or the IRS to do something. And now when you're talking about Treasury coordinating with DOE and other groups in the government, it's a challenge. And so they've gotten to this point where they've made some decisions on certain of the credits. And to me, that is their starting point. And so, for example, one thing we're talking to clients about, we've got some clients who care about 40B, the SAF blenders credit. We've got a number of clients who care about that. But we have a lot of clients who really aren't planning on blending sustainable aviation fuel this year. But what we're talking to them about is take a look at the 40B GREET model and the guidance around that. If you care about 45Z, the clean fuel production credit. And this is the time to comment on the 40B GREET model. Again, because that I think is going to be the starting point for what we're going to see for 45Z.
And so if you guys haven't seen 40B, that came out about a week and a half ago. 40B's GREET, a couple weeks ago, not favorable to RNG, and does duplicate a lot of what we've seen in the spaghetti on the wall from things like 45V, where you have first productive use and challenges to book and claim, et cetera.
Well, Heather, and that's a great example, right? Because we saw that in the other guidance as well on 45V, and so they carried over, some of that from 45V into 40B. And again, these are difficult decisions they're making, and so once they've made them in one credit, that's going to be their starting point, I think, for another credit, unless we tell them, A, why they were wrong in the first credit, or B, why this is, why the other credit should have a different answer.
So I think I want to pivot a little bit away from specific alphabet soup talk on tax policy, talk a little bit more about this concept that was teed up in the IRA about tech neutrality. So tech neutrality was supposed to simplify all of this, right? And to have some more uniform treatment across the board. But we've not really seen that show up in the words on paper. We've seen a lot of, I would say, discrimination against or for certain technologies, right? Electrolytic hydrogen being one, some of these challenges around RNG. When you look at, in theory, what was supposed to be the goal of tech neutral tax policy, are we getting anywhere close to what was expected? And do we think that as these transition toward that horizon of tech neutrality, when we talk about timelines, do we think we'll get there? Do we think that tax policy will develop in a more neutral way?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not tax simplicity. And people always talk about tax simplicity or tax simplification. This is not that by any stretch. And I know the people who do what I do are spending a lot of nights and days and weekends looking at this because it's not easy. The challenge on some of this is it's easy to understand. So when I look at what clients are coming to us for, right? For years it was, I'm building a solar facility or CHP or biomass facility. And what you're dealing with now is I am building this big project, and the project includes some on-site generation, some off-site renewable generation, some of it's wind, some of it's solar. I'm building, I'm producing hydrogen, I'm producing clean fuels. And I've got this complicated project, and it's really hard. Yeah, it's just really hard for people who, again, aren't engineers in the government to understand all of this. And so it's a process here. We never had this in the code before for years. This is brand new. Wyden's been talking about it I remember going on the Hill at least 15, 20 years ago, and Wyden was talking about tech neutrality. And it's great in theory, and I think it's opening up innovation. We're seeing a lot of innovation, but innovation is hard for tax people who are trying to write rules that'll be in place for at least the next 12 years. And so, and they're worried about, there's been a lot of controversy and litigation over the last 15 years in clean energy credits, and they're worried about all the things that people might do to take advantage of these credits in ways that weren't intended. So, they're starting to write these rules. So we have 40B, and again, to get back into the alphabet soup, sorry about that. It's hard as a tax person not to do that. But we've got a couple pieces of guidance that have come out. We're expecting more tech neutral guidance to come out, hopefully in the next couple of months, and then more towards the end of the year. And again, they're putting things out. Everything comes out in proposed form. There's a notice and comment period and comes out in final form. And I think they're a long way from getting there. I think they've got a lot to do to get this right, but it's a long process. And that's why, either the calls that ABC has and other groups have are so important to get these, coalitions together because they have a long way to go. I think they know they have a long way to go. And when we talk to them, they recognize that there's a lot that they don't know, and they want to hear from industry and all of us who do this. But they want to hear from people because they've got a long way to go. And so this is going to be a process. And the goal right now in this process is we're early on. We want to get as many of the rules right as we can. And there have been challenges. But even if proposed rules come out, final rules come out, there's still opportunities to keep working at this. And this is, the credits are available until at least 2033. Obviously, we don't want to wait a lot of that time to get this right, but there are opportunities to keep changing this, and we just have to keep working at it.
I think that one thing to think about as well is the Congressional Review Act comes into play if these rules aren't finalized by May 22nd, which they're not going to be. So you have the potential for a new president, new Congress to flip this, kind of like what happened with the Clean Power Plan. So there's a lot of risk. But I think we've been working with regulators on 45V for green hydrogen, as well as groups, both on the hourly matching piece for electricity and talking about implementation, not policy. But there is a lot of resistance to biomethane from the environmental groups who are pushing for book and claim on electricity, but not for biomethane. And so I think that's a position where it can be utilized to push against an inability to use the existing infrastructure from a book and claim type model.
So
just on that Congressional Review Act, because this question comes up all the time about, May 22nd is, not very far away right now. And there's not going to be a wave of, huge massive wave of final regulations in the next 10 days or so. The conversations we've had with folks in the Senate and otherwise it was interesting because, I've never worked over there and we've spoken internally, but they don't seem to be all that concerned about the CRA actually causing a rollback of a lot of these credits, regardless of how the election goes. And part of it is just, again, there is a lot of support, generally for the IRA within Congress. So you're not going to hear, a lot of folks in Congress, on the Republican side publicly announcing great support for the IRA, but there is internally great support for a lot of things that are being done in the IRA. So there's probably some things around the edges that may change, but overall, we don't expect a huge pullback of all of these regulations, most of which will come out, in the period after May 22nd or May 28th or whatever the date happens to be on the CRA.
So I think you guys both teed up this concept about book and claim, and what we're seeing develop, I would say just a general softening of support or maybe a challenge. And we've seen it in California with the deliverability requirements in the revised rules. We've seen it in the European markets. We are now seeing it in Treasury policy. And for any of you to answer and give your thoughts on what is the benefit, maybe specifically toward Treasury's policies, but what is the benefit of making that restriction? I know there's a lot of maybe skepticism about tracking systems, maybe Ben can speak to as well, but what do you think is underlying that lack of confidence in book and claim, and how we're seeing that trickle into a lot of these different facets of the industry?
Yeah, so and just kind of briefly a little bit about MRETS. We're a nonprofit registry. We own our own system that is focused on environmental attributes. And I think one important thing, and we talk about this a lot with our board, that we're focused on our belief that clean electrons and clean molecules are going to be the inputs to the economy of the future, and more specifically, the fuels of the future and power. And so we need to track all this through the supply chain as the electrons and molecules move through our economy. So when you're looking at clean ammonia, SAF, clean hydrogen, clean steel, shipping, all of this is going to require an amount of supply chain tracking. I think what's frustrating, we've done a lot of work internationally. So we're the co-founder and one of 3 groups working on the IREC G code. So IREC is an international standards body based out of the Netherlands that creates these standards so environmental attribute markets can be recognized globally. So what's been interesting is that on the power side, electricity side, all of this is domestic. You're not charging batteries on ships and shipping it to Europe. So there's no need to really have an international standard in place. But when you start moving into the gaseous and liquid fuels and compression and liquefaction, the need to standardize all this is really critical. And the example of this is what happened in Europe, where some palm oil was imported under the ISCC model against the rules of the Europeans, and it caused a backlash. And so what the European markets are looking at, or the EU regulators with the uniform database, when you heard people refer to the UDB, that's what they're talking about, is looking at prohibiting the import of low carbon fuels into both liquid and gas into the EU starting pretty soon. They've already started with some of the initial rules. Unless you're using a mass balance system. What's really frustrating about all of this is that the way they define the difference between mass balance and book and claim. So book and claim is you put a molecule into a common carrier network and you don't necessarily think about deliverability or theoretical deliverability. And anyone can claim that even if they're not connected to that network. With mass balance, you're actually require that both a verification of an injection and an off-taker in that network. And it goes even further in some cases where when you're looking at total emissions from a whole system, you track everything that goes in and out of it. I don't think the UDB is necessarily requiring all of that, although what's been interesting is some of the discussions have been concerns from European regulators that if you inject RNG from a facility, and this is just an example, in Arkansas, and you compress it and put it on a ship or liquefy it, put it on a ship in Houston, and it's then imported into the Netherlands and Rotterdam and then sent into the gas network, it's one thing to claim that that is a clean molecule. It's another to say that we've addressed all of the life cycle emissions problems. And there's a lot of concerns that the state, or even more concerning, it sounds like, to the EU government, is the US government would be claiming those emissions reductions from the fuel produced in the US, then the Europeans also would be claiming that. And I think that's where this, and this is my own take on it, is that's where this concern of in definitions between mass balance and book and claim are really rooted in. And so can we verify that there's no similar claims in and I say US, but it's really North America and Canada as well. The concern about this specific issue, if you're not following it, even if you don't export fuels, you should be, because if the EU goes through with this, it's going to mean that all of those existing exporters are going to be looking for a market, which means you're going to have a whole new supply that formerly was selling at pretty high prices from as an export. Now we're going to look for domestic markets. For some consumers, that might be, you're probably going to see prices drop. Obviously, for producers and then the service industry around it, it's not going to be good. And so making sure we're doing a lot to try to work with the EU regulators to get them to understand it. Unfortunately, like, we are very proud to talk about the fact that we're book and claim. However, publicly, we don't really use that, although I'm saying it here, but I don't know if there's any EU regulators in the audience. Just disregard that last explanation, please. But, being very careful, seriously, about those terms. We're pretty loose with them in North American markets, but this could have the potential impact using the wrong word in a meeting. And having met with the EU regulators now quite a bit, it's frustrating. And there's another piece of this that, and I apologize to Amish, because for the tax lawyers, they don't love this, but I was talking to a group of Europeans a few weeks ago. All of our energy policy is tax policy. And that's not really great. And the way that a lot of incentives are done in Europe, when you receive a subsidy, you're usually not allowed to claim those certificates, or there's some more complex rules around that. And that's not the case here. And so some of those tax policy issues will get all rolled up into this. And I think it's going to be a really bureaucratic solution. We're trying to see if the EU will recognize our system. But the problem with that is the European systems are all recognized by individual governments. And the federal government doesn't really bless systems like that. They don't, from ours that serves both compliance and voluntary markets, there's no ability to just go to the US government and say, hey, you're good. We trust this. And so I think that is creating some concern as well. But the Europeans are also worried, because this is the only way that they can meet their decarbonization goals that are strict are through imports of low carbon fuels, hopefully from North American markets.
So I want to pull Richard in here. So a lot of discussion in the European market about validity, right? Potential double counting. A lot of the themes that we've always heard about environmental attributes and who claims what and who pays for what. And a little challenge on life cycle emissions. But I'm curious, Richard, do you feel like in California that was the underlying motivation for some of the deliverability restrictions? Or was that a more generic California first kind of step forward? Or do you really think that they were motivated by some of the concerns that Ben shared about double counting and just LCA validity?
There we go. Thanks, Heather. The agency CARB sees the low carbon fuel standard is really wildly successful ever since its inception, the base work in 2008. And even today, think about some controversy. I'll go directly to your question. I think about controversy in the early years, 2010 through 13, where there were multiple lawsuits. This doesn't match closely to those issues. And there's certainly pushback that you just talked about. And to get to your point, the agency is looking at, with respect to terrestrial transportation, basically heavy duty trucks, it views the implementation of low carbon fuel standards as having played a key role in displacing a significant amount of diesel, right? Both GHG benefits, but also diesel PM. Huge issue from a community perspective. But they also know, by virtue of adoption of a series of zero emission heavy duty regulations, advanced clean truck, advanced clean fleet, series of incentives that the population, basically heavy-duty terrestrial transportation consumes about 200 million diesel gallon equivalents. That's shrinking. At the same time, there's a broad number of dairy digesters built in the state and surrounding areas that are coming online. 100 plus are being built. They're looking at the shrinking population of on-road terrestrial transportation in terms of as a recipient for gas, new plants coming online, and as a policy call. This is a policy call because they were very clear from an overall accounting standpoint. Life cycle analysis recognizes the low CI that dairy digesters can produce with respect to biomethane and significant low CIs. They're not challenging that. Their point from a policy standpoint, as represented in the proposed amendments, was to start to put some boundaries, both the sunsetting of avoided methane and some constraints on deliverability, really analogous to green electrons, how electricity is already treated in the state. At the same time, this is equally important, the staff report underscored the point that I just made. The state has an ambitious GHG reduction target. We need much more biomethane in the stationary side, in residential, commercial, industrial applications. So they're already signaling the need to have stronger policies as the transportation pool, at least on the terrestrial side. We'll talk a little bit more on SAF and rail and marine, begins to be limited or basically begins to sunset by virtue of these other policies. So that's how that's nested in. It is not a response to EJ demands, which frankly, they want to see dairies. And CARB has pushed back significantly in terms of its partnership with the ag community and the key role that the low carbon fuel standards played, and has stood by that. In fact, if you look at the ambitious targets that the agency doubled down on just in 2022, a tightening of the 2030 target, carbon neutrality by 2045, and underscoring a key policy to get us there is low carbon fuel standards. It's not going anywhere. It's going to get tighter and so a stronger signal. We're clearly at a market position right now, latest credits of $50. CARB see that as an opportunity to send a stronger signal and get more reductions. So although it's a perturbation from an investment standpoint, they're looking at it as we can extract more reductions from this program by significantly increasing its stringency.
So I think it's fair to say, if I summarize, that the CARB's actions, even though they're very similar to, on paper, if you read it, they look very similar to some of the European restrictions or Treasury's skepticism or actions around book and claim. They're coming from a very different motivation. They're coming from less of a distrust on book and claim and more of a policy or market signal perspective, to your point about the greater need for biomethane in other markets, both in LCFS programmatically, but elsewhere in California. So this isn't California signaling to the industry that they don't like the science or the concept of mass balance or book and claim, but that they want it to just simply be directed at other places. Is that fair?
That's correct. CARB is a regulatory agency and take a lot of pride in the implementation of these programs, cap and trade and low carbon fuel standard, and the high compliance rates, and stands by their effective implementation. But what they know is basically a fraction of 1% of the natural gas consumed in the state's transportation. 99.9% of it is used on the stationary side. They can't meet the statewide GHG targets without significantly reducing the carbon intensity on the stationary side, because you're not going to electrify industry, residential, and commercial applications. Certainly not going to do it anytime soon. The policies actually going forward are focused on new builds. You're going to have a legacy stock in place for decades, and the policy is going to be, how do you have a greater share of renewable content in those delivered fuels?
I also think it's not necessarily always skepticism within Treasury, and having worked with the folks there, some of the smartest people I've talked to, but a lot of them are economists and a lot of them came from academia. And there was a strong cohort of folks within the federal government and DOE and EPA that worked on environmental attribute markets and electricity, and were able to relay all of that knowledge and information to the Treasury people writing the rules, both the lawyers and the academics. Whereas this is, and we tried to do our best at this, but there's not as much of a familiarity in those agencies with the type of attribute markets for energy that is not producing electricity. And so I think that is where some of it is. And it's not that I'm trying to defend them or criticize them. I think it's a reality. And so that's where it's really important to get engaged in this. And I think the other piece that's a little bit of a frustration is there's a lot more in the earlier days of electricity, some standardization, familiarity. If every state is going to implement their own low carbon fuel standard differently and create little carve outs and niches within those programs, it's going to create a really difficult process to have a bigger North American or specifically United States policy that is that we can then communicate to countries that are going to import our fuels, and they can understand what they're actually importing.
And I'd say, I mean, one thing to keep in mind historically is this kind of skepticism at IRS and Treasury, though, about book and claim isn't just limited to the IRA. I mean, there are other situations where this has been relevant pre-IRA, and they've taken a similar approach of just having this sort of skepticism. So, for example, there was a tax credit for taking certain alternative fuels and blending them with diesel fuel or gasoline. And one of the questions we asked is, can we take that fuel, put it on a common carrier pipeline, and then take off the fuel on the other side under a book and claim system? And the answer was, and then blend it on the other side, because you can't blend the fuels before it goes on the pipeline. And the answer was, no, we're not comfortable with that. We've asked about, pre-IRA, you could only get a tax credit for battery energy storage if it was part of the solar project or the wind project. And we said, well, what if I build it a mile down the road and this power is going to be treated as being stored on that solar project a mile down the road? And they said, we're not comfortable with that. I think they're continuing to take this view. And I think a lot of it is driven by other agencies and other experiences of just, how do we get comfortable with this? How do we make sure this works? And how do we, at the end of the day, have an auditor go out and make sure they can confirm that someone actually used, those attributes?
So I think if I look at the landscape of everything we've just covered, there's a theme of what I would consider policy purgatory right now, right? Where you have the right arm not talking to the left arm, both state and federal, where you have market signals in California, to your point, Richard, that are signaling a desire to move biomethane into something like SAF, and hydrogen in the LCFS space to move it into stationary sources. But that butts up against the lack of support from Treasury to move in those same sectors where biomethane has been restricted for hydrogen and now SAF production. And then we see restrictions coming out of Europe related to book and claim and exports. And we see similar restrictions on the stationary source side, right, at the state level, where you have utility commissions and others sort of putting downward pressure on those market opportunities. So in this sort of purgatory land that we're sitting in policy and these mixed market signals, where do we think those fuels will be directed? Do we think that the state policies will start to pull those fuels into state markets with the lack of maybe national direction in terms of markets? Where do you guys feel like that's headed next? Because if I'm a developer and I'm sitting on the sidelines, I've got no solid, predictable market direction in any of the things that we've just talked about.
Yeah. So I'm looking down because I have some data that I figured I would talk about. So you're not just taking my word for it, but one thing that we saw, so just in 2023 alone, there were 2 million voluntary retirements in our system. So for non-compliance purposes for state programs, that's a 365% increase over 2022 numbers. And we had 777,000 corporate retirements in 2023. and only 10,000 in 2022. So I've been talking to a few people here and seeing, I don't, from the business side of things, we don't expect that. It's pretty hard growth to maintain. But I think we're seeing significant growth in those markets. So outside of the compliance opportunities, we're going to continue to see more and more corporate customers enter the market, especially when prices are lower, as some of the LCFS prices have come down. There's going to be more and more interest. It started with the European multinationals that had operations in the U.S., but we're starting to see more and more interest in some of those smaller entities and even U.S. specific customers, whether it's because in their supply chain they're being demanded to reduce their emissions, or it's a story they want to tell to their customers, or what we've seen also is ESG has become a poisonous word, but a lot of executive comp packages have started looking at these numbers, and so there's pressure on the executive leadership at public companies to address this. And even in private equity deals, you see these issues coming out and investments being made specifically in these companies. So I think we're going to continue to see that growth and that opportunity there. And what we also have seen is a flip in these attribute markets where it was once always driven by compliance requirements, so RPS policies. Excess went to voluntary markets, but now we're starting to see the voluntary customers start demanding things that aren't required of the compliance markets, and those end up making their way into it. So I think we're going to continue to see a lot of interest, and that's where, and this isn't just like to drive growth at MRETS. It's more about we think that there's opportunities to mitigate some of the pricing risk with longer term voluntary agreements that you're not going to get in compliance markets.
Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, a little more on opportunity, and I'm anchoring off of targets, GHG reduction targets in statute. This is law. California has established that it's never walked back from the stringency of those. They get tighter. So people refer to AB 32, which established a 2020 target of getting to 1990 emissions. That was beat a few years ahead of schedule, in spite of claims it was unachievable or would tank the economy. There's a 2030 target that was 40% below 1990 emissions. The state doubled down, it's 48% now, and a carbon neutrality target 2045. And if you back out of that and ask, what does that mean? You look at the GHG inventory. Where are the emissions coming from? About 40% of that is transportation. If I include upstream refining, closer to 48%. Industrial sector, about 15%. Commercial or residential, another 10, 15%. Then high GWP, ag, some other sectors. You can't get to the 48% 2030 target without addressing every one of those sectors with a series of policies. Low carbon fuel standard cuts across several. So going forward, pulling in aviation. Now that clearly is a current staff proposal to capture intrastate aviation as a regulated party versus an opt-in sector. Those policies will continue to move forward. How do you capture aviation? How do you fold marine in as well as rail? Each of those sectors, which aren't currently subject to the regulation or captured in the current proposal, they're a logical extension in terms of the opportunities to further reduce GHG emissions. The other is the role of renewable hydrogen. The state, through its scoping plan, basically the plan laying out how are we going to get to 48% GHG reductions by 2030? How are we going to get carbon neutrality by 2045? Hydrogen is going to play a key role, renewable hydrogen, both in transportation and the industrial space. And a key issue is going to be, what are the key hydrogen carriers? How are you going to get hydrogen from point A to point B, and what's going to be the efficient way to do it, and what role does biomethane contribute in terms of that hydrogen? And the last point, just to underscore my previous observation, is on the industrial, commercial, residential in-stock legacy fleet that's going to be on natural gas. My home, I have a natural gas furnace, natural gas water heater, natural gas cook stove. I'm plumb for it. That's not going to change for decades. The opportunity to reduce my carbon footprint is related to the carbon intensity of that delivered fuel and having a stronger signal to incentivize moving that gas into the pipeline and directing at stationary sources. Last point is on the opportunity that it was talked about this morning, that co-digestion of organics, diverted organics from landfills. The state has a huge issue with respect to landfill space and specific laws requiring that those organics be diverted from landfills. They're having significant challenges in terms of infrastructure. You can't compost all that. It's the opportunities presented by co-digesting and getting that gas into the pipeline and partnering, basically a policy that deals with diversion of organics from landfills, generating a low carbon intensity fuel that we need to displace petroleum and further contributing to the state's efforts to reduce GHG emissions. It's those policies.
So do you think California, we should anticipate those new policies coming out of California? I think we've seen 1383, we've seen 1440 that sort of tipped the hand toward those stationary sources and those market opportunities, but they've floundered, to be quite blunt. Do we think that given the changes at CARB with the LCFS program, that will spur on fresh activity for the stationary side?
Yeah, the starting point since the inception of AB 32, it called for the state to develop a scoping plan. What is the game plan to reach GHG reductions? From that scoping plan, a series of policies, regulations, incentives, how incentives were directed, followed. The latest scoping plan, the last scoping plan, was just adopted December of 2022. December 2022, what happened? It initiated or basically catalyzed the amendments, the update to low carbon fuel standard, catalyzed the current process to update the cap and trade regulation. And to your point, also the other series of policies in terms of the work with the PUC on a 1440 2.0. Much of this work has started. Do I think that'll happen? I do, but I think this is a few years for it to play out because there's issues. Obviously, the economic issue and how do you deal with lower income folks and a whole range of related policies. But if you back out in terms of the ambition and how you're going to deliver that ambition, you can't leave these large sectors that I'm talking about on the table. You need to, nor can you electrify. A lot of folks want to jump ahead 50 years. Many of these sectors, the only way to deliver those reductions and meet these targets is gaseous and liquid fuels and driving the CI down.
And I would agree with that. I think the fact that there's existing infrastructure for these fuels is important. It's impossible to build common carrier infrastructure in this country, whether it's a transmission line or a pipeline. And so, we talk a lot about hydrogen, but how are you going to move it around? People don't like gas pipelines. They're going to not like hydrogen pipelines running through their backyard. And so if you have existing infrastructure that you can use, that's going to be, I think, really critical. A missing piece of this discussion that you did just bring up, which I think gets often ignored, is those hard to abate industries, the steel companies, the ammonia producers. They are being forced to decarbonize, but they're also part of a global supply chain, and there's a lot more price pressure. It's one thing for a data center to talk about being 100% renewable. They can control their electricity loads. They can move load to other data centers when prices are higher or emissions are higher in certain parts of the world or country. They have that flexibility. A steel plant doesn't have that. And I think I was talking to a company that's looking at building a green steel plant. If they look at hydrogen, which is what they are considering, they need to build a gigawatt of generation just to supply that green steel producer. That's more than the utility's whole load that currently serves them. Where are they going to build all that? How are they going to finance it? So those are really big questions. And now we saw states really falling over themselves to bring data centers in. And now some of them are rethinking that, not because data centers are bad, but you need to power those. And they are demanding, and I believe that's a good thing, renewable resources to power them. But you have to build that infrastructure to get those electrons there. And that's going to be difficult. And I think we look at hydrogen. I was much more bullish a year ago than I am now on the potential for green hydrogen, mostly because you have a 50% energy loss. So for every 1 megawatt of electricity you put into that electrolyzer, you're going to get 50 kW. And that's anecdotal. I mean, there's some electrolyzers that get more, some less, but you lose 50% of that energy right there. At least with the SMR, you get much higher. I've been told 90+%. Someone probably could correct me if I'm wrong. So, if you need to supply, and a green steel plant can't just flex their load like a data center can. They need a steady stream of hydrogen to be delivered, and that's going to be difficult even with loose rules. So we have to think about where we're going to direct that. I think in the next few years, we're going to see a lot more hard to abate industries start seriously considering biogas, biomethane, because you can't electrify, as you mentioned, even residential loads. While they might be the easiest in theory to electrify, all that infrastructure is there, and it involves replacing people's HVAC units and all these other things that is going to be much more difficult than those hard to abate large customers that will come in and be buyers.
All right, I'm going to pause. So we have about 10 to 12 minutes left. So I want to open up for questions from the audience. I certainly have more questions I can ask the panel, but I want to give you guys the opportunity to step to the mic and ask any questions that you guys might have for our experts. Don't be shy. Yeah, feel free to holler out or come to the mic, either one.
I just had a quick question.
Sure, Shannon.
Amish, you mentioned that if we don't hear guidance by the 22nd, it's not a death sentence for an R&D pathway.
Her question, I'll just repeat it for those that might not have heard it. So hearing for guidance or final rulemaking, or so new or finalized activities out of Treasury after May 22nd is not a death sentence. Can you just confirm that in terms of timing?
No, that's right. And look, we're not going to have a lot of guidance before May 22nd. There's a lot, we have some proposed rules and we don't have a lot of final rules even. And so, our expectation is not that all of these regulations that come out after May 22nd or whatever the day is, I know it kind of shifts around a little bit. But whatever that is, our expectation is that they're not all going to be pulled back. I think there are some along the edges, maybe in the EV space perhaps, where there's a little bit more controversy. But overall, the expectation is that we're not going to see a mass rollback or pullback or hold on all of these regulations that come out after May 22nd.
And I would agree too. I mean, I think, first of all, the unlike a lot of previous rules, the Congress that passed this put a lot more specificity into the law, so that it's going to be a lot harder to overturn, where you have like major deference to the agencies. The more conservative Supreme Court doesn't like that. That's the extent of my Supreme Court knowledge. But I think, and also very little environmental policy gets overturned like that, even though first of all, most people don't vote on it. People run on it, but when they get into power, because they're popular, it's a way to get elected, not necessarily to do it. And then what you have is a lot of companies already investing in this. And so you get things like what happened with the vehicle fuel standards, where they sued the government. They ended up winning, but they had already adhered to most of the underlying policies, so they're not going to get rid of it. So I think it's unlikely, and there are things that are in statute, like they have to use the GREET model, all that other. So some of those major pieces that are specific, they can't do anything about. They're not going to have the votes to repeal it. And that May 22nd, I think it's 60 business days or 60 congressional meeting days. It's something like, so that's where it's a little bit flexible, but it was to prove the point that even it's very unlikely that, it will likely get final rules before an administration change, if there is one, but I don't know if it's going to be much sooner than that.
And the other part is people are, to the point, people are making investments based on proposed regulations, sub-regulatory guidance. A lot of dollars are going into investments and potential investments in a lot of states, including red states and blue states. And so, the desire to do something that would cause some of those investments not to be made in some of those states is, I think, going to keep a lot of folks on the Hill from wanting to just overturn or pull back on these regulations.
All right, I'm going to wrap up that question because we have people who want to do questions. So Shannon, if you could connect afterwards, that would be awesome. Question?
So circling back to the conversation of book and claim and mass balance, how do you account for scenarios where the input doesn't match the output? And then, sorry, it's kind of multi-part question. From my understanding from at a book and claim model or a mass balance model, there's no real requirement to physically determine biogenic content of the fuel that you're working with. So at what point is there advocacy for that type of testing? And when maybe is book and claim or mass balance not enough proof per se?
So when you talk about, are you talking about losses, like transportation system losses? When you say it doesn't match what's going in, doesn't match what's coming out? Or?
No, so like say it's like a co-processed fuel or something, and the feedstock you use is X% biogenic when you start, but then your final product, it doesn't have that exact percentage of biogenic content.
So we allow for multiple feedstocks. I'm speaking just for our system, but we're the only one. And we require engineering analysis to show what the inputs and outputs were. So you would only get certificates that you can then transfer to make a claim on for what was the renewable or biogenic. So, if you were putting in something that wouldn't be qualified, then you wouldn't be able to receive those certificates for that. So that's accounted for. What these systems don't do is we don't calculate for losses, but if you choose to put a CI score into our system, which is optional, the models like GREET do account for that. So it'll be reflected in the CI score, not necessarily the volumes. This is a weird thing, but the FTC guidelines are not clear about this in terms of they use the words renewable energy and electricity interchangeably, and under electricity protocol, it has to be a 1-to-1. So if you used 100 megawatts to say you're 100% renewable, you have to match it with 100 megawatts of RECs. But a lot of people, and I personally like the idea of doing more of an emissions type approach where you just have to reduce your emissions to zero, but that may not be a 1-to-1, and it's not clear if the FTC would accept that. And if you're being conservative in your approach, and as most companies, corporate customers are, they're probably going to just do 100% match. Whether we see a movement to more emissions matching, that's also controversial in places like Europe where they view that as offsetting. And so we get into a linguistic debate again about that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Another question?
You mentioned about the discrepancy between carbon credits in Europe and in the US, and how that may affect exports. How big a problem can that be, i.e., what percentage of American biogas is exported to Europe, and how much of that could be potentially hurt by this harmonization of carbon credit that is going on in Europe, and this discrepancy with the US way of measuring these credits?
I don't know if does anybody know the percentages?
I don't know if
exported
someone
right
in
now?
the audience might know the number.
Percent. I don't think it's significant. I wouldn't say it's, I mean, I think if you had that backflow like you were talking about before, right, that influx back into the domestic market, I think you'd feel it, but I don't know the exact percentage that's currently exported.
Yeah, and so I don't know, but like you mentioned, because this industry isn't massive, any backflow is probably going to be felt. But there are companies who their whole business is modeled around this, so they're going to feel this pain significantly.
It's actually the perfect segue to my question. So I wanted to go back to the UDB. In terms of the American Biogas Council, have you gotten a position on that? Are you working towards potentially advocating within the EU or supporting someone else who is?
So currently, we're supporting others who are. So we are definitely engaged in the conversation. And as this develops and gains momentum, we are getting deeper and deeper into that role. And we are having more and more members, as we talked about the policy purgatory that is happening domestically, we have more and more members interested in engaging in the European market, which is also driving our activities on the policy level. We're also trying to better understand not just the attribute tracking, but the carbon intensity or the carbon modeling that is attached to that market, because it is different than what we're used to here with GREET, right? And understanding how advocating for that market and that potential carbon structure or methodology, what that does in terms of overall value for the industry. So the short answer is yes, and we're getting deeper by the day. Thank you.
And even the UDB is just one of those issues. There's also CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is going to require compliance. So we're hoping there will be some similarities. The worst thing that could happen is they create a wholly different process for CBAM and UDB, and you have to adhere to both. And so CBAM is going to be on imported final products or materials that are going to go in. But if you supply biomethane to a customer, they're going to want to see all that information. And it's likely it will be a similar process of certificates or contractual chain of custody that you can verify with European regulators.
Awesome. Thanks. We'll take one more question.
Yeah, thank you all. And I'm pleased that you mentioned demand side policies a few times, ACF, ACT in California. I guess I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how you expect certain vehicle related policies to impact the market for biogas moving forward. Specifically, I'm thinking about the EPA's recent heavy duty vehicle rule that was finalized that essentially, requires certain large fleets to go all electric. Of course, we have California's policies too. And, what your thoughts are on those as to how they impact biogas, and especially as those policies, might impact the LCFS, the RFS, and, other policies on the supply side moving forward. Thanks.
I can start and others can add a bit, but from the California perspective, I touched on earlier that a series of policies have focused on transitioning the transportation sector to electrification. So light duty, ACC2, medium, heavy duty, both advanced clean truck and advanced clean fleet regulations. And then there's a series of off-road regulations as well. Those will take decades to fully implement because basically there are, with the exception of the fleet rule, the manufacturer requirements. There are basically requirements on manufacturers, OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, in terms of the equipment vehicles that they sell into the California market, with generally a higher, progressively higher share percentage of zero emission requirements. That's how both of those regs, ACT and ACC2, generally work. The fleet regs are different because that's on the demand side. So that those fleet regs focus on medium and heavy duty. They're subject to relatively small fleets of 50 vehicles or more. But to your point, in terms of its interaction with the low carbon fuel standard and the biomethane, my point earlier was that a relatively small population of heavy duty vehicles in the state use biomethane, are on natural gas. Basically, it translates into about 200 million diesel gallon equivalents. And by virtue of ACT, Advanced Clean Fleet, the reduction of incentives, that population is decreasing. It's decreasing. It's not going to increase. But where I touched on earlier was where I think the more significant opportunities aren't in that terrestrial legacy fleet. It is basically capturing marine. It's capturing locomotive. It's capturing rail, potentially aviation. And it's the transition of production of hydrogen. The state, there's $10 billion being invested by industry and another $1.5 billion by DOE in terms of supporting hydrogen production, infrastructure, and so on, but will have its applications as well. And then my last point in terms of opportunities, it really is on the stationary side. It's significant, right? It's an order, 2 orders of magnitude greater than this shrinking population in terms of the terrestrial application. So that's the link. The other link clearly in low carbon fuel standard, the number of deficits that are generated by traditional fuels, traditional gasoline and diesel. As the program gets tighter and tighter, those fuels are, even though the population's decreasing, the number of deficits is increasing that need to be offset by credits. So you're going to have a progressively higher demand for those credits, higher number of deficits that need to be offset, and put upward pressure in terms of the credit price under the program.
All right, so we're at time, so I'm going to ask you guys for one closing answer, and we'll keep it really short so we don't keep anybody from lunch. So we talked about a ton of stuff today, primarily in CFS, European markets, tax policy, et cetera. And we've talked a lot about this concept of purgatory, and we need something to drive the market, right? What is going to be the thing, the sleeper policy that you guys think is going to be the light at the end of the tunnel that's going to sort of be the vacuum for the industry in the next, call it, 2 years?
Maybe I'll be a little contrarian and say I don't even know if it's a policy as much as I think the voluntary customers and more organic growth are really critical. And unlike the government, they won't really walk back their policies very easily. So what we've seen with corporate customers is even when prices go up and it hits their bottom line, they don't walk back their commitments because of whether it's fear or the drive to do good. Governments change those. So I think we often rely a little too much on regulatory policy and not as much on that voluntary demand.
All right, so voluntary corporates. Richard, what do you think?
I'm going to go to evidence. And if I think about historical implementation in California's program, the change, even though we talk about policy, and they certainly have an impact, at the end of the day, it's real investments that are actually catalyzing change. It's engineers, it's scientists, it's accountants and staff, even a few lawyers along the way, implementing these programs that are generating real evidence of workable programs that are providing opportunities. Workable climate policy, workable policy has to create economic opportunity that attracts investment. And I point to the policies that the states implemented that is attracting billions and billions of dollars of investments and is catalyzed not just action in the state and results. At the end of the day, you can talk a good game. If you're not seeing results in the policies and a growing economy and economic opportunities, no one is going to want to copy or model that program. The reason California has partners in other states and international jurisdictions is because of results and the economic benefits and the associated reductions that are being realized.
All right, so continued positive execution, sounds like. Stay the course. What about you, Misha?
You know, I will say I think it's going to be these tech neutral policies in the code, because what we're seeing is it's frustrating people today because they're saying, well, we can't get tax credits for lots of things today. But what we're seeing is incredible innovation. People are looking to figure out ways to reduce CI scores, looking at new technologies, combining things that we just haven't thought about before. And so the number of companies we have coming to us now, and this is just, you know, I feel like the tip of the iceberg, right? This is going to go on for a long time. The innovation we're seeing is incredible. And the technology just really blows our minds in terms of what people are thinking about. And again, it's early on. So I think over time, as people are incentivized to be creative, to find new solutions to the climate change problems, they will find those solutions because I think they're, you know, the rules as they continue to evolve will help them make those financially viable.
So I think it's really interesting and maybe a little encouraging silver lining that none of your path forwards were actually government or policy. They were all driven by other things. So after an hour talking about policy and how it's driving the market, the viewpoint forward potential is not policy at all. So give these guys a hand. Thank them for their time. Thank you very much. And I think we have a break. So thank you very much for joining us and enjoy lunch.